Revolt Against the Modern World by Julius Evola. Forward. For quite some time now, it has become almost commonplace to talk about the decline of the West and the crisis of contemporary civilization, its dangers, and the havoc that it has caused. Also, new prophecies concerning Europe's or the world's future are being formulated. And various appeals to defend the West are made from various quarters. In all this concern, there is generally very little that goes beyond the amateurishness of intellectuals. It would be all too easy to show how often these views lack true principles, and how what is being rejected is often still unconsciously retained by those who wish to react, and how for the most part people do not really know what they want, since they obey irrational impulses. This is especially true on the practical plane, where we find violent and chaotic expressions typical of a, quote, protest, unquote, that wishes to be global, though it is inspired only by the contingent and terminal forms of the latest civilization. Therefore, even though it would be rash to see in these phenomena of protest something positive, they nevertheless have the value of a symptom. These phenomena clearly illustrate that beliefs that were once taken for granted today no longer are, and the idyllic perspectives of, quote, evolutionism, end quote, have come of age. An unconscious defense mechanism, however, prevents people from going beyond a certain limit. This mechanism is similar to the instinct found in sleepwalkers who lack the perception of height as they amble about. Some pseudo-intellectual and irrational reactions seem to have no other effect than to distract modern humans and prevent them from becoming fully aware of that global and dreadful perspective according to which the modern world appears as a lifeless body falling down a slope which nothing can possibly stop. There are diseases that incubate for a long time and become manifest only when their hidden work has almost ended. This is the case of man's fall from the ways of what he once glorified as civilization par excellence. Though modern men have come to perceive the West's bleak future only recently, there are causes that they have been active for centuries that have contributed to spiritual and material degeneration. These causes have not only taken away from most people the possibility of revolt and the return to normalcy and health, but most of all, they have taken away the ability to understand what true normalcy and health really mean. Thus, no matter how sincere the intention animating those who today attempt to revolt and to sound the alarm may be, we should not cherish false hopes concerning the outcome. It is not easy to realize how deep we must dig before we hit the only root from which the contemporary negative forms have sprung as natural and necessary consequences. The same holds true from those forms that even the boldest spirits do not cease to presuppose and to employ in their ways of thinking, feeling, and acting. Some people, quote, react, end quote. Others, quote, protest, end quote. How could it be otherwise considering the hopeless futures of contemporary society, morality, politics, and culture? And yet these are the only, quote, reactions and not actions or positive movements that originate from the inner dimension and testify to the possession of a foundation, a principle, or a center. In the West, too many adaptations and, quote, reactions, end quote, have taken place. Experience has shown that nothing that truly matters can be achieved in this way. What is really needed is to not toss back and forth in a bed of agony, but to awaken and get up. Things have reached such a low point nowadays that I wonder who would be capable of assessing the modern world as a whole, rather than just some of its particular aspects, such as, quote, technocracy, end quote, or the, quote, consumer society, end quote, and of understanding its ultimate meaning. This would be the real starting point. In order for this to happen, it is necessary to leave the deceptive and magical, quote, circle and be able to conceive something else, to acquire new eyes and new ears in order to perceive things that have become invisible and mute with the passing of time. It is only going back to the meanings and the visions that existed before the establishment of the causes of the present civilization that it is possible to achieve an absolute reference point, the key for the real understanding of all modern deviations, and at the same time to find a strong defense and an unbreakable line of resistance for those who, despite everything, will still be standing. The only thing that matters today is the activity of those who can ride the wave and maintain firm in their principles, unmoved by any concessions and indifferent to the fevers, the convulsions, the superstitions, and the prostitutions that characterize modern generations. The only thing that matters is the silent endurance of a few, whose impassible presence as stone guests help to create new relationships, new distances, new values, and help to construct a pole that, although it will certainly not prevent this world inhabited by the distracted and restless from being what it is, will still help to transmit to someone the sensation of the truth, a sensation that will become for them the principle of a liberating crisis. Within the limits of my possibilities, this book hopes to be a contribution to such a task. Its main thesis is the idea that the decadent nature of the modern world. Its purpose is to present the evidence supporting this idea through reference to the spirit of universal civilization, on the ruins of which everything that is modern has arisen. This will serve as the basis for every possibility and as the categorical legitimization of a revolt, since only then will it become clear that one is reacting against, but also and foremost in what name. By way of introduction, I will argue that no idea is as absurd as the idea of progress, which together with its corollary notion of the superiority of modern civilization has created its own positive alibis by falsifying history, by insinuating harmful myths in people's minds, and by proclaiming itself sovereign at the crossroads of plebeian ideology from which it originated. How long has mankind gone if it is ready and willing to apostatize a cadaverous wisdom? For this is now how we should regard the perspective that refuses to view modern and new man as decrepit, defeated, and crepuscular men, but rather glorifies him as the overcomer, the justifier, and as the only real living being. Our contemporaries must truly have become blind if they really thought they could measure everything by their standards and consider their own civilization as privileged, as the one to which the history of the world was preordained and outside of which there was nothing but barbarism, darkness, and superstition. It must be acknowledged that before the early and violent shakings through which the inner disintegration of the Western world has become evident, even in a material way, the plurality of civilizations, and therefore the relativity of the modern one, no longer appears, as it once used to, as a heterodox and extravagant idea. And yet this is not enough. It is also necessary to be able to recognize that modern civilization is not only liable to disappear without a trace, like many others before it, but also that it belongs to a type, that the disappearance of which has merely a contingent value when compared with the order of the things that are, and of every civilization founded on such an order. Beyond the mere and secular idea of the relativism of civilizations, it is necessary to recognize a dualism of civilizations. The considerations that follow will constantly revolve around the opposition between the modern and the traditional world, and between the modern and traditional man. Such an opposition is ideal, that is, morphological and metaphysical, and both beyond and more than a merely historical opposition. As far as the historical aspect is concerned, it is necessary to indicate the width of the horizons confronting us. In an anti-traditional sense, the first forces of decadence began to be tangibly manifested between the 8th and the 6th centuries BC, as can be concluded from the sporadic and characteristic alterations in the forms of the social and spiritual life of many people that occurred during that time. Thus, the limit corresponds to the so-called historical times, since according to many people, whatever occurred before this period no longer constituted the object of history. History is replaced by legends and myths, and thus no hard facts can be established, only conjectures. The fact remains, however, that according to traditional teachings, the above-mentioned period merely inherited the effects of even more remote causes during this period. Then inherited the effects of even more remote causes. During this period, what was presaged as the critical phase of an even longer cycle known in the East as the Dark Age, in the classical world as the Iron Age, in the Nordic sagas as the Age of the Wolf. In any event, during historical times and in the Western world, a second and more visible phase corresponds to the fall of the Roman Empire and the advent of Christianity. A third phase began with the twilight of the feudal and imperial world of the European Middle Ages, reaching a decisive point with the advent of humanism and of the Reformation. From that period on, the forces that once acted in an isolated and underground fashion have emerged and led every European trend in material and spiritual life, as well as in individual and collective life in a downward trajectory, thus establishing one phase after another of what is usually referred to as the modern world. And from then on, the process has become increasingly rapid, decisive, and universal, forming a dreadful current by which every residual trace of a different type of civilization is visibly destined to be swept away, thus ending a cycle and sealing the collective fate of millions. This is the case as far as the historical aspect is concerned, and yet this aspect is totally relative. If everything that is historical is included in what is modern, then to go beyond the modern world, which is the only way to reveal its meaning, is essentially a process of traveling beyond the limits that most people assign to history. It is necessary to understand that in this direction we no longer find anything that is susceptible again to becoming history. The fact that positive inquiry was not able to make history beyond a certain period is not at all a fortuitous circumstance, nor is it due to the uncertainty concerning sources and dates or to the lack of vestigial traces. In order to understand the spiritual background typical of every non-modern civilization, it is necessary to retain the idea that the opposition between historical times and prehistoric or mythological times is not the relative opposition proper to two homogeneous parts of the same time frame, but rather the qualitative and substantial opposition between different times, or experiences of time, that are not of the same kind. Traditional man did not have the same experience of time as modern man. He had a supertemporal sense of time, and in this sensation lived every form of his world. Thus, the modern researchers of history at a given point encounter an interruption in the series and an incomprehensible gap, beyond which they can only construct any certain and meaningful historical theory. They can only rely upon fragmentary, external, and often contradictory elements, unless they radically change their method and mentality. On the basis of these premises, the opposition of the traditional world to the modern world is also an ideal one. The character of temporality and historicity is essentially inherent only to the one of the two terms of this opposition, while the other term, which refers to the whole body of traditional civilizations, is characterized by the feeling of what is beyond time, namely, a contact with metaphysical reality that bestows upon the experience of time a very different mythological form based on rhythm and space rather than on chronological time. traces of this qualitatively different experience of time still exist as degenerated residues among some so-called primitive populations. Having lost that contact by being caught in the illusion of a pure flowing, a pure escaping, a yearning that pushes one's goal further and further away, and being caught in a process that cannot and does not intend to be satisfied at any achievement, that as it is consumed in terms of history and becoming. That is indeed one of the fundamental characteristics of the modern world, and the limit that separates two eras, not only in a historical sense, but most of all in an ideal metaphysical and morphological sense. Therefore, the fact that the civilizations of the traditional type are found in the past becomes merely accidental. The modern world and the traditional world may be regarded as two universal types, and as two a priori categories of civilization. Nevertheless, that accidental circumstance allows us to state with good reason that wherever a civilization is manifested that has as its center and substance the temporal element, we will find a resurgence, in a more or less different form, of the same attitudes, values, and forces that have defined the modern era in the specific sense of the term, and that wherever a civilization is manifested that has at its center and substance the supernatural element, there we will find a resurgence, in more or less different forms, of the same meanings, values, and forces that have defined archaic types of civilization. This should clarify the meaning of what I have called the dualism of civilization, in relation to the terms employed, modern and traditional, and also prevent any misunderstandings concerning the traditionalism that I advocate. These did not happen once, but they have always been. The reason behind all my references to non-modern forms, institutions, and knowledge consists in the fact that they are more transparent symbols, closer approximations, and better examples of what is prior and superior to time and to history, and thus to both yesterday and tomorrow. It is these alone that can produce a real renewal and a new and perennial life in those who are still capable of receiving it. Only those capable of this reception may be totally fearless and able to see in the fate of the modern world nothing different or more tragic than the vain arising and consequential dissolution of a thick fog which cannot alter or affect in any way the free heaven. So much for the fundamental thesis. At this point, by way of introduction, I would like to briefly explain the method that I've employed. The above remarks will suffice to show how little I value all of what in recent times has officially been regarded as historical science in matters of religion, ancient institutions, and traditions, nor do I need refer to what I will say later concerning the origin, the scope, and the meaning of modern knowledge. I wanted to make it clear that I do not want to have anything to do with this order of things, as well as any other that originates from modern mentality. And moreover, that I consider the so-called scientific and positive perspective, with all its empty claims of competence and of the monopoly, as a display of ignorance in the best of cases. I say in the best of cases. I certainly do not deny that from the derailed studies of the scholars of different disciplines what may emerge as useful, though unrefined, material that is often necessary to those who do not have other sources of information, or do not have the time or intention to dedicate themselves to gather and to examine what they need from other domains. And yet, at the same time, I am still of the opinion that wherever the historical and scientific methods of modern man are applied to traditional civilizations, other than in the coarser aspects of traces and witnesses, the results are almost always distortions that destroy the spirit, limit and alter the subject matter, and lead to the blind alleys of alibis created by the prejudices of the modern mentality as it defends and asserts itself in every domain. Very rarely is this destructive and distorting work casual. It almost always proceeds, even through the order of things that I will mainly deal with in this present work, generally speaking, is that in which all materials having a historical and scientific value are the ones that matter the least. Conversely, all the mythical, legendary, and epic elements denied historical truth and demonstrative value acquire here a superior validity and become the source for a more real and certain knowledge. This is precisely the boundary that separates the traditional doctrine from the profane culture. In reference to ancient times, this does not apply to the forms of a mythological or superhistorical life, such as the traditional one. While, from the perspective of science, what matters in a myth is whatever the historical elements may be extracted from it. In reference to ancient times, this does not apply to the forms of a mythological or superhistorical life, such as the traditional one. While, from the perspective of science, what matters in a myth is whatever historical elements may be extracted from it. From the perspective that I adopt, what matters in history are all the mythological elements it has to offer, or all the myths that enter into its web as integrations of the meaning of history itself. Not only the Rome of legend speaks clearer than the historical Rome, but even the sagas of Charlemagne reveal more about the meaning of the king of the Franks than the positive chronicles and documents of that time, and so on. The scientific anathemas in regards to this approach are all well known. Arbitrary, subjective, preposterous. In my perspective, there is no arbitrariness, subjectivity, or fantasy. Just like there is no objectivity and scientific causality the way modern men understand them. All these notions are unreal. All these notions are outside tradition. Tradition begins whenever it is possible to rise above these notions by achieving a super-individual and non-human perspective. Thus, I will have minimal concern for debating and demonstrating. The truths that may reveal the world of tradition are not those that can be learned or discussed. Either they are or they are not. It is only possible to remember them. And this happens when one becomes free of the obstacles represented by various human constructions, first among which are all the results and the methods of specialized researchers. In other words, one becomes free of these encumbrances when the capacity for seeing from that non-human perspective, which is the same as the traditional perspective, has been attained. This is one of the essential protests that should be made by those who really oppose the modern world. Let me repeat that in every ancient persuasion, traditional truths have always been regarded as non-human. Any consideration from a non-human perspective, which is objective in a transcendent sense, is a traditional consideration that should be made to correspond to the traditional world. Universality is typical of this world. The axiom, quod ubique, quod ab omnibus, et quod semper, characterizes it. Inherent to the idea of traditional civilization is the idea of an equivalence or homology of its various forms realized in space and time. The correspondence may not be noticeable from the outside. One may be taken aback by the diversity of several possible and yet equivalent expressions. In some cases, the correspondences are respected in the spirit. In other cases, they are only formally and nominally. In some cases, there may be complete applications of principles. In others, more fragmentary ones. In some, there are legendary expressions. In others, historical expressions. And yet there is always something constant and central that characterizes the same world and the same man and determines an identical opposition vis-a-vis everything that is modern. Those who begin from a particular traditional civilization are able to integrate it by freeing it from its historical and contingent aspects, and thus bring back the generative principles to the metaphorical plane where they exist in a pure state, so to speak. They cannot help but recognize these same principles bind the different expressions of other equally traditional civilizations. It is in this way that a sense of certainty and transcendent and universal objectivity is innerly established, that nothing could ever destroy, and that could not be reached by any other means. In the course of this book, I refer to various Eastern and Western traditions, choosing those that exemplify through a clearer and more complete expression the same spiritual principle or phenomenon. The method that I use has little in common with the eclecticism or comparative methodology of modern scholars as the method of parallaxis, which is used to determine the exact position of a star by reference to how it appears from different places. Also, this method has as little in common with eclecticism, to borrow an image from Gounod's, as the multilingual person's choice of the language that offers the best expression to a given thought. Thus, what I call traditional method is usually characterized by a double principle. ontologically and objectively by the principle of correspondence, which ensures an essential and functional correlation between analogous elements, presenting them as simple homologous forms of the appearance of a central and unitary meaning, and epistemologically and subjectively by the generalized use of the principle of induction, which is here understood as a discursive approximation of a spiritual intuition, in which what is realized is the integration and the unification of the diverse elements encountered in the same one meaning and the same one principle. In this way, I will try to portray the sense of the world of tradition as a unity and as a universal type, capable of creating points of reference and of evolution different from the ones to which the majority of people in the West have passively and semi-consciously become accustomed. This sense can also lead to the establishment of the foundations for an eventual revolt, not a polemical but a real and positive one, of the spirit against the modern world. In this regard, I hope that those who are accused of being anachronistic utopians, unaware of historical reality, will remain unmoved in the realization that the apologist of what is concrete should not be told, stop or turn around or wake up, but rather, go ahead, achieve all your goals, break all the dams, faster, you are unbound. Go ahead and fly with faster wings, with an ever greater pride for your achievements, for your conquests, for your empires. With your democracies, the pit must be filled. There is no need for fertilizer, for the new tree will grow out of your collapse. In the present work, I will limit myself to offering guiding principles, the application and the adequate development of which would require as many volumes as there are chapters. Thus, I will point only out the essential elements. The reader may wish to use them as the basis for further ordering and deepening the subject matter of each of the domains dealt with from the traditional point of view by giving to them an extension and a development that the economy of the present work does not allow for. In the first part, I will trace directly a kind of doctrine of the categories of the traditional spirit. I will indicate the main principles according to which the life of the man of tradition was manifest. Here the term category is employed in the sense of a normative and a priori principle. The forms and the meanings indicated should be regarded not as realities proper, inasmuch as they are or have been realities, but rather as ideas that must determine and shape reality and life, and their value being independent from the measure in which their realization can be ascertained, since it will never be perfect. This should eliminate the misunderstandings and the objections of those who claim that historical reality hardly justifies the forms and the meanings, more on which later. Such a claim could eventually be validated without reaching the conclusion that in this regard everything is reduced to make-believe, utopias, idealizations, or illusions. The main forms of the traditional life as categories enjoy the same dignity as ethical principles. They are valuable in and of themselves and only require to be acknowledged and willed so that man may hold steadily to them and with them measure himself in life, just like traditional man has always and everywhere done. Thus, the dimension of history and of reality has here merely an illustrative and evocative scope for the values that, even from this point of view, may not be any less actual today and tomorrow than what they could have been yesterday. The historical element will be emphasized in the second part of this work, which will cover the genesis of the modern world and the process that have led to its development. Since the reference point, however, will always be the traditional world in its quality as symbolical, superhistorical, and normative reality, and likewise, since the method employed will be that which attempts to understand what acted and still acts behind the two superficial dimensions of historical phenomena, space and time, the final outcome will be the outline of a metaphysics of history. In both parts, I think that sufficient elements have been given to those who, today or tomorrow, already are or will be capable of an awakening. Part 1. The World of Tradition. The skillful masters of the Tao in old times, with a subtle and exquisite penetration, comprehended its mysteries and were deep also so as to elude man's knowledge. Shrinking looked like those who would wade through a stream in the water, irresolute like those who are afraid of all those around them, evanescent like ice that is melting away, unpretentious like wood that has not been fashioned into anything, vacant like a valley, and dull like a muddy water. Who can make the muddy water clear? Who can secure the condition of rest? They who preserve this method of the Tao do not wish to be full of themselves. It is through their not being full of themselves that they can afford to seem worn and not appear to be new and complete. Tao Te Ching, 15. From R. Van Over, Chinese Mystics. 1. The Beginning. In order to understand both the spirit of tradition and its antithesis, modern civilization, it is necessary to begin with the fundamental doctrine of the two natures. According to this doctrine, there is a physical order of things and a metaphysical one. There is a mortal nature and an immortal one. There is a superior realm of being and an inferior realm of becoming. Generally speaking, there is a visible and tangible dimension, and prior to and beyond it, an invisible and intangible dimension that is the support, the source, and the true life of the former. Anywhere in the world of tradition, both East and West, and in one form or another, this knowledge, not just a mere theory, has always been present as an unshakable axis around which everything revolved. Let me emphasize the fact that it was knowledge and not theory. As difficult as it may be for our contemporaries to understand this, we must start from the idea that the man of tradition was aware of the existence of a dimension of being much wider than our contemporaries experience and call reality. Nowadays, after all, reality is understood only as something strictly encompassed within the world of physical bodies located in space and time. Certainly, there are those who would believe in something beyond the world of phenomena. When these people admit the existence of something else, however, they are always led to this conclusion by a scientific hypothesis or law, or by a speculative idea, or by a religious dogma. They cannot escape such an intellectual limitation. Through his practical and immediate experiences, modern man, no matter how deep his materialistic or spiritual beliefs may be, develops an understanding of reality only in relation to the world of physical bodies and always under the influence of his direct and immediate experiences. This is the real materialism for which our contemporaries should be reproached. All other versions of materialism that are formulated in scientific or in philosophical terms are only secondary phenomena. The worst type of materialism, therefore, is not a matter of an opinion or theory, but it consists in the fact that man's experience no longer extends to non-physical realities. Thus, the majority of the intellectual revolts against materialistic views are only vain reactions against the latest peripheral effects stemming from remote and deeper causes. These causes, incidentally, arose in a different historical context from the one in which the theories were formulated. The experience of traditional man used to reach well beyond these limits, as in the case of some so-called primitive people, among whom we still find today a faint echo of spiritual powers from ancient times. In traditional societies, the invisible was an element as real, if not more real, than the data provided by the physical senses. Every aspect of the individual and social life of the people belonging to the societies was influenced by this experience. On the one hand, from the perspective of tradition, what today is usually referred to as reality was only a species of a much wider genus. On the other hand, invisible realities were not automatically equated with the supernatural. Traditionally speaking, the notion of nature did not correspond merely to the world of bodies and of visible forms, the object of research of contemporary secularized science, but on the contrary, it corresponded essentially to a part of invisible reality. The ancients had a sense of a dark netherworld, populated by obscure and ambiguous forces of every kind, the demonic soul of nature, which is the essential substratum of all nature's forms and energies. That was opposed to the super-rational and sidereal brightness of a higher reason. Moreover, the term nature traditionally included everything that is merely human, since what is human cannot escape birth and death, impermanence, dependence, and transformation, all of which are characteristics of the inferior region. By definition, that which is has nothing to do with human and temporal affairs or situations, as in the saying, "The race of men is one thing, and the race of gods is quite another." This saying retains its validity, even though people once thought that the reference to a superior otherworldly domain could effectively lead to the integration and the purification of the human element in the direction of the non-human dimension. Only the non-human dimension constituted the essence and the goal of any truly traditional civilization. The world of being and the world of becoming affect things, demons, and men. Every hypostatic representation of these two regions, whether expressed in astral, mythological, theological, or religious terms, reminded traditional man of the existence of the two states. It also represented a symbol to be resolved into an inner experience, or at least in the foreboding of an inner experience. Thus, in Hindu, and especially in Buddhist tradition, the idea of samsara, the current that dominates and carries away every form of the inferior world, refers to an understanding of life as blind yearning and as an irrational identification with impermanent aggregates. Likewise, Hellenism saw nature as the embodiment of the eternal state of deprivation of those realities that, by virtue of having their own principle and cause outside of themselves, flow and run away indefinitely. In their becoming, these realities reveal a primordial and radical lack of direction and purpose, and a perennial limitation. According to these traditions, matter and becoming express the reality that acts in a being as an obscure necessity, or as an irrepressible indetermination, or as the inability to acquire a perfect form and possess itself in a law. What the Greeks called, the Orientals called, Christian scholastic theology shared similar views, since it considered the root of every unredeemed nature in terms of cupiditas and of aperitus innatus. In different ways, the man of tradition found in the experience of covetous identification, which obscures and impairs being, the secret cause of his existential predicament. The incessant becoming and the perennial instability and contingency of the inferior region appeared to the man of tradition as the cosmic and symbolic materialization of that predicament. On the other hand, the experience of asceticism was regarded as the path leading to the other region, or to the world of being, or to that which is no longer physical but metaphysical. Asceticism traditionally consisted in values such as mastery over oneself, self-discipline, autonomy, and the leading of a unified life. By unified life, I mean an existence that does not need to be spent in search of other things or people in order to be complete and justified. The traditional representations of this other region were solar symbols, heavenly regions, beings made of light or fire, islands, and mountain peaks. These were the two natures. Tradition conceived the possibility of being born in either one, and also the possibility of going from one birth to another, according to one saying, a man is a mortal god, and a god is an immortal man. The world of tradition knew these two great poles of existence, as well as the paths leading from one to the other. Tradition knew the existence of the physical world and the totality of the forms, whether visible or underground, whether human and subhuman and demonic. A world beyond this world. According to tradition, the former is the fall of the latter, and the latter represents the liberation of the former. The traditional world believed spirituality to be something beyond life and death. It held that mere physical existence, or living, is meaningless unless it approximates the higher world or that which is more than life, unless one's highest ambition consists in participating and obtaining an active and final liberation from the bond represented by the human condition. According to tradition, every authority is fraudulent, every law is unjust and barbarous, every institution is vain and ephemeral unless they are ordained to the superior principle of being, unless they are derived from above and oriented upward. The traditional world knew divine kingship. It knew the bridge between the two worlds, namely initiation. It knew the two great ways of approach to the transcendent, namely heroic action and contemplation. It knew the meditation, namely rites and faithfulness. It knew the social foundation, namely the traditional law and the caste system, and it knew the political earthly symbol, namely the empire. These are the foundations of the traditional hierarchy in civilization that have been completely wiped out by the victorious anthropocentric civilization of our contemporaries.